The sky had not been blue in years. It settled instead into a heavy bruise, bronze and iron, the colour of old coinage left out too long in a storm. Mornings began with a light that was always too close, like the sun had been pushed nearer to the earth and didn't know when to stop. Nights held a heat that wouldn't let you sleep. The heat kept the dust moving and the insects quiet, as if everything with the breath of life had agreed to hold it in. Water, when you found it, was no longer a given. Rivers turned to memory, ribboned scars of pale stone and salt where my tax map once showed deep blue. The reservoirs that fed cities cracked like pottery and gave up their last breath in the same year the first harvests failed. Coastal towns, ones I'd seen in photographs when the world had more colours, are now marshes of rusted cars and dead mangroves, half-sunken homes leaning like apologetic monuments. Where the floods came, they left salt and rot that kissed the soil sterile. Where the drought burned, the ground split and spat up black smoke from runs of peat that used to lie mute beneath the loam. Cities died like animals on the road, poorly and in the place they were born. Skyscrapers peeled their facades like old wallpaper. Glass fell in sheets that still glitter in the ashlight. Shopping centres, places of noise and light, are now caverns of mould and graffiti, bones for scavengers to pick through. Bridges hang half-finished over riverbeds that have not seen water in seasons. Tunnels hold the smell of old fires and something sharper, like old fear. Landmarks you could have pointed to on a postcard have become hazards. A museum with its roof caved in. A cathedral whose spire is now a nest for wind. A stadium full of sand and the hollow echoes of long-ago cheers. The air tastes like yesterday's news, papery and stale, with the ash of 100 burned forests. Wildfires came faster and more often. The seasons collapsed into each other, and none of them behaved like they once did. You learned to measure time in smoke, the colour of it, the direction it moved, whether it carried the smell of pine or of synthetic chemicals from a factory gone wrong. Sometimes the wind brings with it a metallic tang that makes my teeth feel loose. Sometimes it brings silence so thick I could hear the generator's heartbeat across the valley. There are pockets of green left. Pockets are not places, they are arguments. People guard them like family wealth. They have names you don't speak if you want to sleep. The orchard, the basin, the last spring. Those places are ringed with tripwires and barbed wire, and men who used to smile at you in a different lifetime. Survivor groups call themselves hopeful things. The Haven, the Concord. But hope, in most of its modern appearances, looks like ration lists and patrol schedules. Factions form around water and fuel, around ideas and old grievances. Some are just scavengers in better jackets. Government didn't so much fall as dissolve, like a sugar cube in a pot of bad coffee. There are faces on posters with the same smiles, but the institutions that once supported them, courts, schools, municipal services, now exist as rumour or as something half-functioning, run by whoever has the fuel to keep a truck moving that day. Some city halls still have lights, but the lights are run by generators that cough and die if you ask them to work through a winter. The police are fewer and different. Some became protectors, others predators. We learned fast which patrols could be bargained with and which would make bartered promises into teeth marks. What endures are the small mechanics of human continuity, trade routes, rumour networks, and the old stubborn technology of radio. The radio is the nearest thing to an altar we have left. A handful of amateur transmitters stitch people together. Voices out in the dark calling each other by barter and by name. The stations are skeletal, an array of scavenged batteries, dented copper, a microphone wrapped in duct tape. But when a voice comes through the static, it is a promise that someone, somewhere, still remembers how to say hello. The frequencies are crowded with lies, gossip, and prayers. We learn to be careful with the truth and economical with kindness. Hospitals are logistics ghosts. The ones that survived are triage tents and shelves of pills kept in boxes with other goods. Coffee, seed packets, faded toys. Universities publish what knowledge they can on handwritten sheets and pass them like contraband. Religion reconfigures itself into whatever human beings need most. A bed, a ration, a reason to keep moving. Children, when you see them, are raised by the world now. They know the names of metal parts and how to patch canvas. They do not know the syntax of city governance or the taste of unfiltered water. There is violence always, but not the dramatic kind of the movies. Most violence is quiet. The theft of a filter cartridge in the night, the cutting of a rope ladder. Sometimes, though, there are scaled shows of force, armed columns moving through open land like a bad omen. The land around our settlements is mined for the obvious and the small. Canned food, batteries, people who know how to read the old manuals. You must learn to look at an abandoned car and see not a car, but a trove of survival. Belts for straps, seats for insulation, glass for signaling. But dread does not erase beauty entirely. In the hollow of a ruined overpass, a patch of moss remembers how to be green. Rain, when it comes, shakes itself like a gift. A child laughing when they find a can of peaches is a short, sharp thing of pure sound that slices clean through the grey. I keep those sounds in my pocket, because when the night gets long and my hands are empty, memory is the only currency that doesn't devalue. Walking the edge of this world is a study in waiting. You watch the horizon for storms and for convoys, for smoke that could mean either rescue or fire. You listen to the radio for voices that might be friends or might be a lure. You learn to be suspicious of certainty. The map of the world is now a palimpsest. Old lines rubbed away, new lines scratched in with desperation. Everything feels like it could change on the next gust of wind, and sometimes it does. I was a different man before the sirens lost their interest in us, before the council meetings dissolved into shouting, before my city started to look like a photograph left in the sun until the edges curled and the faces faded. If you ask for a name, I'll give you one. Miles Harrington. It fits the life I had once. Neat, ordinary sounding. The kind of name that lives well on a business card and in polite conversation. Now it lives on the back of a coffee tin that holds spare screws and a stack of transmitter logs. Names have a way of getting worn thin here. Mine still fits, so I keep it. I run a radio. Not the glossy station you imagine, with glass and neon and staff who roll their eyes at bad callers. Mine is a hut of corrugated metal lashed to a foundation of scavenged cinder blocks. A single window patched with an old road sign, and a hand-cranked generator that sounds like a grumpy animal when I ask it to work. The antenna is an elbow of wire on a rusted pole, lashed to a bent sign that says, ironically, welcome. I keep it tuned to frequencies that catch other people breathing. The tinny voices from the orchard, the clipped harmonics of a barter post 2 valleys over, the long static moan of a lonely amateur in a town that calls itself the Basin. I speak into a microphone patched with duct tape and hope. I am a voice that collects other voices and throws them back into the dark like a lifeline. Survival here is not cinematic. It is arithmetic and habit. It is the daily accounting of water and calories. The rituals you build to keep living from sliding into something less. I keep 3 water systems. A rain catchment made from a shopping cart liner. A charcoal sand gravity filter I assembled from a busted coffee urn and layers of gravel and cotton. And a small solar still I learned to make from cut plastic and a shallow basin. The solar still will not hydrate you after a hot march, but it will keep your throat from scratching out in the long nights. For food, I barter and forage and preserve. I can can peaches in a storm with a pressure cooker salvaged from a teaching hospital that used to teach things we pretended to care about. I know where to peel old insulation from copper pipes without making sparks. I keep a root cellar beneath the radio room, actually a hole lined with pallets and tarps, where root vegetables and salted fish sit in burlap sacks, breathing slow and cold. I know the language of scavenging. A car is not a car. A car is a cache. Seatbelts for tie-downs, a battery for a power source, if you can find the fluid. A radio whose guts are an encyclopedia of capacitors and coils. An abandoned house is a map of what people needed before they left in a hurry. Jars half full of pickles, a Bible, a children's shoe. When I go out, I carry a list that never changes. Water, fuel, spare parts, and one small thing for someone else. A book, a spool of thread, a bar of soap. That last one is the moral economy that keeps me human. You cannot survive alone without another person to tell you what you were like. What keeps me moving is not the idea of salvation. I am not moved by some grand vision of rebuilding cities or rewriting laws. I move because there are people who answer when I call. There is a girl in the orchard who sings off-key into the dusk sometimes, and I have learned the cadence of her breath. There is an old man who traded me a can of condensed milk for a set of spark plugs. He left a folded photograph of a woman with his change. There is the boy who fixed our solar still last winter, and who owes me nothing, but gives me the precise and necessary kindness of his mechanical fingers. These threads, expectation, obligation, love, guilt, tie me to the world. Guilt is a heavy chum for a heart that tries to float. I had a family. The memory is a folder with tabs. Lena, the way she hummed when she stirred coffee. Jonah, who liked to stack rocks and knock them down and call it engineering. I remember trying to teach him to count before the counting stopped meaning anything. One fire took them from me. Not one of those flash-in-the-pan burns, but a long, slow loss that started with contaminated wells and ended in a chest full of long letters and the weight of names I couldn't save. I find their things sometimes. A shoe buried under ash. A little chipped bowl that holds my extra resistors. I keep those objects like admitting my failures. They remind me of what I refuse to let become permanent. My willingness to care. There are days when regret is a constant low-grade ache. I think of choices I made and the ways the map would bend if I had chosen differently. I think of the time I stayed in my apartment building while the evacuation orders became suggestions, and how a few more hours of cowardice cost me a life. But confession is not the same as resignation. You can count your ghosts without letting them eat the present. That is a discipline I learned in the cold months. Memory is necessary, but it cannot be all-consuming. Otherwise you fold into it and become an exhibit. The body carries its own ledger. Burns, a scar on my forearm from a bad soldering job. The way the cartilage of my ears has thinned from nights listening to static. Sometimes the edges of what I used to be are evident in my hands. The careful cut of an engineer. The patient touch of someone who once rewound motors for a living. My mind has learned to inventory things relentlessly. Numbers are comforting in a world that otherwise refuses consistency. How many liters left? How many cartridges? How many names answered on the log this week? The abstraction keeps panic at bay. I have learned a small curriculum of civil engineering, botany, and psychology, enough to keep the generator running, the garden turning, and the people fed. Knowledge in this age is practical. I can sew a canvas patch, splice a line, distill salt from brackish creek water, and jury-rig a radio tube from parts that would have been trash a decade ago. The university where I used to work sends out newsletters, hand-copied pages traded like contraband, about seed varieties that might resist saline soil. We test them like small rituals of hope. The experiments are not glamorous, but they are proof that someone still believes in the future. Trust is a currency more fragile than batteries. I have trusted and been betrayed. Once I let a patrol into the compound because they said they were food carriers. They left with more than they brought. That night I could not sleep. Betrayal sharpens your rules. Never open the gate without seeing the goods. Never surrender the primary water key. Never give out location coordinates for a cache, except to someone whose hands you have touched, and whose name you can say without flinching. We have created a moral code out of necessity, and it is strict, but it is not cruel. There is a distinction between protecting what is scarce and becoming the sort of person who hoards until joy is impossible. There is a tenderness in the routines that survive. On the radio, I read names of people who came through and left messages. I read them at dawn when the world is most honest. Not because I am important, but because the act of naming keeps the dead from being mere weather. I have a ritual, a cup of thin coffee, a pad of paper, and 3 minutes of quiet before I crank the generator. Those 3 minutes are not wasted. I collect myself, scan the logbook, and remember why I built this small island of signal. It is for the voice that will come in the night asking for the coordinates of a well, for the laugh of a child that bends the edges of my day back into something bearable. People tell stories about the apocalypse like it is a single event, a day of thunder and finality. They forget it is a long subtraction. Houses, laws, and certainty erode one by one. The bravery here is not in grand gestures. It is the bravery of getting up and making coffee, of fixing a torn tarp in rain, of giving your last can of milk to the child whose mother is sick. It is the bravery of radio voices that keep saying, "We are here," even when the echo is thin. If you listen to me on the frequency, you will hear a tired voice that still holds the shape of hope. You will hear a man who has made peace, not with loss, not with the world's injuries, but with his own inability to control everything. I keep going because the radio tells me stories I cannot ignore. I keep going because someone, somewhere answers back. I keep going because the small acts of kindness are, in their sum, a rebellion against the dark. When the night presses in and the generator coughs low, I think of Lena stirring coffee and Jonah stacking rocks. I think of the sound of a child laughing over a tin of peaches, and how loud it can be when you hold it in your palm. Those memories are not a chain. They are a compass. They turn me toward the people who still answer my signal. They pull me to repair the antenna another morning, to ride out the storms, to barter my labor for a sack of beans. They make me finally useful. That usefulness is enough. It is not heroic. It is stubborn, necessary, and human. It is how I keep the world from telling me I'm useless. It is an explanation that fits in the palm of my hand. among resistors and a small folded photograph. It is why I speak into the microphone every night, to remind someone else that they are not alone. Either, they say the crisis began quietly, as all great betrayals do, an inch at a time, until you realize you have no edges left to hold. For us, it was the slow failure of the water. At first, it was rumor at the market. A spring that used to run clear down by the old mill had gone salty, a well lampooned for its brown foam. Then came the harvests that tasted of dust and metal. The sheep withered in their pens. The maps with blue rivers rubbed out by use and time. 3 years ago, the rain stopped being a calendar event and started being a rumor told in the mouths of children. We started to measure seasons by fires and by storms, not by dates. Now the weather does things it never used to do. Heat waves sit on a place like a weight and never move. A storm will form in the Atlantic and then refuse to travel, stalled by some wind pattern I learned to call the trough when I taught basic meteorology, and which now behaves like a stubborn animal, slow, vicious, indifferent. The jet stream buckles and folds, in a way my old professors said would happen if you shove enough heat into the system. The result is extremes that don't cancel each other out. They stack. One part of the world bakes while another drowns. Where I live, the worst of it is drought turned into fire, turned into dust, turned into a kind of poisonous haze that refuses to settle. We have storms now that look like the sky breaking. They come with a pressure that threatens to buckle roofs, and with lightning that seeks metal like a scavenger. When the rains finally come, they are not mercy, but violence. Torrents that scream off the roofs and run where the soil is dead, taking what little topsoil there was and leaving gullies where gardens used to be. Then, because the ground cannot keep the water, the floods will carry salts and industrial runoff from old factories and dump them into the basins we used to trust. Water in this age often wears two faces. It wants to heal you, and just as readily, it wants to kill you. There is a practical science to this, or at least a pattern. Heat increases the rate of evaporation. More evaporation means the atmosphere can hold more moisture, but the movement of that moisture depends on winds and temperature gradients that have been altered by melting ice, deforested plains and heat islands, where cities used to cool themselves with trees, and a million small decisions. The result is that some places, our places, lose the steady, gentle rain that fed farms and refilled aquifers. Rain that does come falls in convulsions. When it rips across a valley already compacted and crusted from drought, the water cannot soak. It runs off, carrying topsoil into streams that clog, turning old rivers into lethal mudslides and poisoning the remaining groundwater with whatever it picks up along the way. Survival, which had been a daily exercise in economy, became a strategic project. We ration water by litre and by rule. Each person receives a daily allotment, a cup for cooking, a cup for washing, a cup for drinking in a pinch. You learn to make that cup count. You learn to slow your breath when work is hard to conserve moisture in your lungs. The gardens we have are careful surgical things. Drip irrigation when we can cobble a pump. Shaded beds wrapped in salvaged fabric to keep soil temperatures down. Mulch is made from the shredded cardboard of supermarkets we raided for cans. We turn to crops that would not be extravagant about water. Roots and certain legumes, ancient seeds that stubbornly resisted the new salt in the soil. We experiment with biochar, burning biomass into a form that helps soil hold water and nutrients. But even that requires wood, and wood is a scarce currency now. Fuel is its own politics. Diesel is gold. Propane is worth its weight in promises. Batteries die slow deaths of corrosion and charge cycles, and replacement cells are a thing of myth. The generator that feeds the radio used to be a miracle. Now it is a pet I nurse like a child. I log its hours. I rotate its fuel. I keep a list of parts I need and parts I will never find. When a convoy passes through with a barrel of fuel, the math of kindness gets complicated. Barter it for antibiotics, for food, for a favor that may or may not be repaid. People who control fuel control movement, people who control water control life, that control breeds predators. We have patrols that started as protectors and somehow turned into predators. There are collectives that name themselves in optimistic ways. The Meridian, the Concord. But where water and fuel concentrate, power does the simplest thing it always does. It consolidates. Some groups patrol with rifles and enforce rules. They set tolls on roads, a ration of water per crossing, a can of fuel for safe passage. Others are thieves who move at night, cut a fence, take a pump, and leave a note that reads like a prophecy. This is the new order. Raiders hunt in bands. They do not fight for ideology. They fight for supply lines and the right to take. Not all encounters are violence. There are traders, people who travel with packs and lists, and the kind of honesty that comes from long walks and hard winters. I met one such trader in the charred remains of a motel off Highway 3. He introduced himself as Elias and had a ledger with names I recognized. We traded, my patch cables for a sack of millet. He told me of a commune to the east called the Basin Collective that had set up a reed bed filtration system, a technology borrowed from old wetland science where reeds and microbes clean water by oxygenating and feeding on contaminants. It sounded like an oasis in a storybook. I had been listening for stories like that on the radio for years. Some small part of me wanted to believe Elias, and a larger part wanted his millet. There is always a choice when someone offers you a line to follow or stay. Trust is the brittle thing in that choice. I have followed convoys that promise safe water and found traps instead. I have turned away from obvious caravans that smelled of fear and luck. Last month, the orchard sent an emissary up the ridge, Marta, with eyes like a hawk and a pack of bandages, and she brought a map stitched from scavenged paper and a description of a new phenomenon, black rain. The black rain came down after a storm that smelled like burnt plastic. It left a film on the leaves and a sickness in the throat of the goats. We quarantined the animals, washed the roofs, retreated into a protocol that felt half ritual and half science. Boil, filter twice, test with litmus strips salvaged from a school lab. We lost 2 goats anyway. The math of survival sometimes reads like a ledger of acceptable loss, one you never become comfortable with. Supply chains, the fragile things that once hummed invisibly through our lives, are now memories stitched into rumors. Medicines are scarce, antibiotics are expensive, and doses arrive in parcels hidden by couriers who risk entire livelihoods. When someone gets sick here, really sick, the choice is often between expensive antibiotics and a careful regimen of hydration and clean dressing that sometimes works. Births happen in tents, with gloves washed and reused, and the new ones learn the vocabulary of survival before they learn letters. Education is a barter. The university professors I knew distribute photocopied manuals on soil remediation and plant genetics like contraband. Small, hopeful documents passed hand to hand. Because resources are limited, community decisions become the tough calculus. Do you divert water to the elders or the children? Do you allocate fuel to the farmer who could turn a field into a year's food? Or to the ambulance that might carry an infected person? We hold councils, but council does not solve scarcity. Sometimes decisions are violent, but often they are simply desperate. Deliberations that end in a vote, and in the quiet weeping of those who cannot accept the outcome. There is a scientific truth that no one wants to wear as a badge. Once you remove topsoil and its living structure, it is difficult and slow to bring it back. Soil is not dirt. It is an ecosystem. It takes generations to rebuild what floods and heat and misuse strip away. You can add nutrients, you can compress charcoal into the soil to help it retain water and microbes, but the scale is enormous. We are fighting erosion with buckets while the world erodes with the authority of a natural law. In the middle of this, rumor does what it always has done. It becomes currency. A whisper of a well that never went dry can bring a convoy. A photograph of green sent back from some enclave causes fights that leave men in the road. Lies travel fast because hope is a commodity that tastes sweet to people whose throats are dry. My crisis, the one that keeps me awake in the dark hours by the radio glow, is both common and personal. The radio is a narrow thing, a wire and a mic, but it is where the lines of human desperation cross. People call in with coordinates and needs. Others call with offers. Yesterday a voice came on, trembling with a recording of children singing. The caller wanted to know if anyone near the basin had any spare sugar. Sugar is not a survival need. It is a human need. It is the thing that marks festival and comfort. I patched him through to a woman in a valley 2 ridges over who had traded a box of sugar for a day of generator work. No one expected me to mediate such trades, but mediation is what the radio does. It threads a fragile economy of kindness through the wreckage. Actionable knowledge matters. When a well runs low, you test it with a clear jar. Let it sit. Look for oil sheen, for particulate, for discoloration. Boil where you can. Filter always. Make a simple filter. Layers of cloth, sand, then charcoal. Charcoal is not just fuel. It is a purifier. Learn to read the land. Where the green stays, follow it. Shade matters. Plant during the cool hours, not the day. Rotate crops to avoid exhausting the soil. Capture as much rain as you can. Every roof can be a cistern if you rig gutters and barrels. Even a tarp can be angled into a container and catch a few litres in a storm. Build slow sound filters if you can. They take time but work with gravity. Preserve food by canning, by drying, by salting where you can. Keep seeds from the best plants. Those become the foundation of future fields. Above all, organize resources locally. The longer the supply line, the more likely it is to be cut. The crisis is external and internal at once. Externally, the environment has been reshaped into something that does not readily give. Internally, the pressure piles up. Loss upon loss. Small defeats that accumulate into a kind of fatigue. The moral injuries of choices you had to make. Each new storm is not only weather, it is a reminder of how quickly the lives we have cobbled together can be unmade. When I think about the future these days, I think less about grand rebuilding and more about stewardship. How to keep the small springs from failing. How to keep the generator breathing for another month. How to teach a neighbour to make a solar still and not to curse when the first cup is bitter. The crisis is not a single enemy to be defeated by a single battle. It is 1,000 small, smart acts of preservation, knowing when to share and when to hold, when to move and when to hold ground. That is the work now. It is urgent, and it is unglamorous. It is also, in its stubbornness, our only hope. The air kept getting thinner, like a page being ripped from a book. At first you didn't notice the space it left behind. You only noticed how your fingers bled from rubbing the same place on a rope too long, how the skin on your hands split in places it never used to. Then you began to count things differently. Not in dates, but in bottles, in litres, in the number of hours the generator will cough before silence. That counting became a drumbeat. It set the pace of everything. We were running lower than the ledger suggested. The rain that had come in violent fits last month had given us a short reprieve. 2 weeks where the cisterns filled and people smiled like they were brand new. Then the black rain came and the smiles soured. The garden survived in corners, but the root cellar was down to a month of saved beans if we rationed strictly. Fuel for the generator sat at 3 days of medium use and looked at me like a thing that didn't belong to me at all. I could smell the economy of our settlement collapsing, an acrid, nearly metallic scent that always preceded a fight. The orchard was a fragile geometry of fences, tarps, and hope. It held because people believed in the fence. It held because Marta and the old men with calloused hands patrolled the perimeter nightly, and because we had learned to be nimble with our defenses. But belief and fences are porous. Word gets out. Traders tell stories. Desperation travels on the backs of those willing to pay with lies. The first real escalation was a night raid that smelled like burnt coffee and bad decisions. They came not as a column, but as a thoughtless shadow. 5 people, quick, wearing mismatched jackets and the blank expression of hunger that becomes a uniform. They skirted the outer traps, cheap wire and a bell, and cut a ladder where the line was weakest. I heard the boy, the one who'd fixed the solar still, cursing under his breath, heard someone run, heard the scrape of a can pulled off a shelf. We responded with the standard. Shouted alarms. A few flash bangs. Nothing like the old world's fireworks. These were tin cans filled with pebbles and an old flare, and the practiced holler of people who have rehearsed panic into choreography. 2 of them fled into the night with a sack of lentils and a battery. One of them, the leader, stayed and smiled in a way that made my mouth dry. He had teeth in different stages of repair and eyes that had been sharpened by taking. After they left, we did the math and stitched our wounds. We lost a week's food, a battery, and something else that hurt more. A sanctified sense of safety. The boy's face had a slow, hard line of betrayal that I recognized. He went quiet for 3 days, and then came back a shade colder, as if a window had been replaced with glass, and he had learned the sound of his own reflection. The raids got smarter after that. We found traps bypassed in ways that suggested they had been watched. Someone was mapping us. Someone had learned our patterns. It made me think of Elias and his ledger, and the easy way his stories spread warmth like bait. I do not want to be suspicious of people who bring millet when I am afraid of running out of beans, but the ledger is a ledger. Names, dates, routes. If you have the ledger, you can predict a place's hunger. If you can predict hunger, you can plan for profit. At the same time, resources tightened in other ways. The river that once ghosted through the valley now ran in a shallow, concentrated ribbon, slick with a sheen that I did not like. Tests with litmus strips and 3 rounds of boiling still yielded a cough from anyone who drank it after a long day. The goats kept coughing too. We were losing livestock, and without livestock there is no fertilizer, no milk for the children, and an obvious shrinking of hope. And then the radio started carrying new words. Well of glass. It started as a rumor, the sort that gets traded like contraband, spoken low and with a kind of reverence. The well of glass was described as a place where water pooled in a basin that shone under the moon like a cracked mirror. It was said to be fed by a spring that had not gone salty, not for years, maybe ever. It was spoken of in different voices, a trader from a coastal caravan who claimed to have seen it from a hilltop, a priest in a tin hut who said he had baptized his niece in its edge, a woman on a bartering frequency who said she tasted its water and cried because it tasted like clean things. I listened and logged each mention, parceled out credibility like we parcel out sugar. Rumors are a kind of weapon and a kind of prayer. They carve at the edges of sanity until belief and skepticism fight like dogs over a single scrap. I had seen mirages before, places where a little green on a hill turned out to be a patch of plastic and paint. So the well could have been anything. It could have been a trap. It could have been a natural spring. It could have been a marketing ploy by a collective to draw people to a controlled resource. Or it could have been a miracle. That last idea was dangerous because it makes people forget how to calculate. Should we follow a rumor? The calculus is cruel. Send a scouting party and you risk them. Ignore it, and you risk losing hope. The decision sits in your mouth like an unchewed seed. Marta wanted to go. She had a map of possible sources, old aquifers, noted in faded geology textbooks the professors had copied and circulated. She said the well of glass might be fed by an underground fault line that still intersected with an ancient aquifer. She had learned how to read topography from the margins of a student's notebook. Her hands trembled when she spoke, but not with fear, with forward motion. Elias offered a guide, a man with a good back and a cart and an eye for safe routes. He wanted fuel in exchange. The question was not whether any single person was honest, but whether we could afford the gamble. My inward weather was worse. Trust is currency, and I was nearly bankrupt. Betrayals stacked in my memory like unpaid bills. The raid had been a bruise, the leader's smile, a reminder of the cost of a single moment of misjudgment. I had let someone in before because hope had a way of speaking like a plea. The last time I had let a convoy through without verifying their manifest, they had taken more than they had left. The memory of their faces in the dawn, 3 men with empty bellies and heavier hands, still tasted metallic when I thought about it. I could feel the old radar of caution come up. Verify, triangulate, and do not move on hearsay. But the ledger of need had been climbing. The children were crying more often for sweet things. The generator would not run 2 full days at anything like full capacity, and without it, we could not keep radios online half the night for the calls that saved lives. Marta argued that the well could mean the end of ration lists. She argued with a clarity that made the elders nod and the young hold their breath. If the well was real, it could change the arithmetic of the orchard. If it was a trap, it could end the orchard. We compromised in the only way that seemed morally possible. A small scout, 2 people and a cart, one to watch the path and one to carry supplies. I volunteered to listen on the radio and keep our frequency open. It felt like a role I could defend. Less risk of death, more chance to keep a promise. But volunteering is its own kind of cowardice when you are the one who makes rules. I heard the distrust in the elders' eyes when they looked at me. They trusted me with the generator and with the way I talked to strangers on the air. They trusted me because I have been wrong and then fixed the wrong. They trusted me because I had a stubborn kindness they could not refuse. The scout team left. Under a rising sun that looked like the belly of the world, Marta rode with Elias's guide, a hand on a strap and a pack of bandages slung across her chest. The boy who had fixed the still waved them off with a face made of set clay. He was angry, and I could not tell whether it was for the raid or for being excluded. Their departure left an absence like the removal of a chair. We went back to the routines. The morning cup that tastes more like hot water than hope. The list. Fuel. Liters. Hours. I took the generator's hours and stretched them like bread. In the days after, the raids intensified. It seemed as if someone had sensed our potential weakness and pressed. A convoy attacked a supply line 2 valleys over and took most of what they carried. The radio hummed with the news. A string of voices reporting and re-reporting, each adding a detail or a fear. I relayed some of it and withheld the rest. Information can be balm or match. If people believed a convoy had been decimated, they might panic and abandon the orchard, which would itself be a victory for whoever wanted to take it. The ethics of rumor management weigh on you when the stakes are human lives. On the third night, a voice crackled in on our frequency that was not one of our regulars. It was a man whose breath sat on the mic like frost. "Martyr's party," he said. "They took the road. They went north. There's a patrol on the ridge. Black flags." Huh. The sound broke. For a moment, the signal was all static and a noise like a sob. Then the line went dead. I called back, my throat clamping. No answer. My hands moved like a machine with its own memory. My pencil across the logbook. My ear to the speaker. Panic is a contour you learn to flatten. You do not want to put the orchard into motion for nothing. Yet the thought of Marta and the scout on a road, watched by a patrol with black flags, those are the kinds of details that make the hair on your neck stand up. Black flags, in our vocabulary, meant a group that had chosen a symbol of erasure. They took what they needed and left nothing. They were rumored to be violent beyond rationing. Seeing them meant danger. I sent out a request for volunteers to form a shadow line. Quiet, not a force meant to fight, but to observe and, if possible, intercept. Hands were raised slowly. The boy who fixed the still did not raise his. He stood by the generator, his jaw working. He said later he would not leave the station unattended. I could not blame him. Night fell like a curtain. I sat at the radio and listened. Every creak sounded like a secret. Every distant howl was a potential disaster. I thought of Lena stirring coffee, of Jonah stacking rocks. I thought of the well of glass, a possible salvation that might be a lie. The tension in me was twin-headed, the fear for the scout team and the fear that our fragile economy would be swallowed whole if we acted too rashly. At 2 a.m, a transmission came through that made me drop my pencil. It was a single sentence, low and steady. "We found water. It is clear. We are cut off." The voice was Marta's. She did not sound triumphant. She sounded tired and honest, as if she had walked through a truth and emerged at the other side, only to find the world had not changed its mind. That message was hope and a fuse. It tightened everything. We had to decide in the empty hours between sleep and dawn whether to move a rescue party or to shore up the orchard against the inevitable. That someone would come for the well of glass, and not all of them would come asking politely. We had to recon with the cost of trust again. We had to remember that sometimes the best way to save people is not to send them into a known ambush. It is many small increases in pressure until something gives. Our pressure was building in the forms of raiders, dwindling supplies, and the tantalizing architecture of a possible water source. The coming days would not be simple. They would ask us to make choices that will write themselves into the ledger of who we become. Merciful, cautious, or hardened. The radio sat on my table like a small, honest God, waiting for a voice to pray through it. I did not know if the prayer would be answered. I only knew what my hands could do. Patch wires, inventory fuel, and keep the microphone ready. That is the part of me that believes in the power of small acts. That, in the end, might be enough to tilt the ark towards survival, or it might not be enough at all. When Marta's voice broke across the static, 3 words, half a prayer, time contracted. We found water. We are cut off. The syllables sat on the air like stones. For a moment, I could hear nothing but the hum of the generator and the uneven breath of the orchard sleeping on its own arrangements. Then the radio filled with other noises. A cough from the boy at the still, the soft crinkle of someone folding a map, a woman asking for the coordinates again as if speaking them aloud would make them truer. The practical part of me started counting immediately. How many hands could we spare? How many litres could we haul? How many hours would the generator run if we used it to charge the battery banks and run pumps? The moral part of me did other math. How many people did I owe because of past mistakes? Because of the way I'd stayed a day too long in my apartment? Because Lena and Jonah's things lived in my pockets like religion? We were already thin. The cellar held a month of dried beans at rigid ration. The generator had 3 days of medium use and a half-dozen spare spark plugs. Fuel was a rumor you whispered, not a thing you owned. Sending out a rescue was to spend precious fuel and risk the lives of people who were already valuable to us. Our mechanics, our patrols, our waterkeepers. Not sending out a rescue felt like a different kind of death. Marta's coordinates were north, 2 days along a ridge, and then down into a small valley, the old maps labelled as a seasonal stream bed. The radio chatter made the place sound like a myth. I put my palm on the transmitter and felt the faint heat of its living, an odd human thing to do. We had options, each of them ugly. We could send a larger party to secure the site, which would deplete our defences and show the world where our protections were weakest. We could send a small, fast team to bring back water and hope. We could do nothing and ration ourselves down to something less than living. Then the black flags appeared. We had heard rumours before, men and women who worked in bands and whose emblem was a slit of black cloth. They didn't ask for water, they took it. They didn't ask for permission, they made an absence. The voice that came in on the next transmission was thin, low with static. Black flags on the ridge. They're scouting the North Road. The words put iron in my hands. I imagined fear as a physical weight, an anchor, a chain. That was what I felt. Black flags meant a siege. It meant the well of glass, if it was real, would be contested not by negotiation but by force. We made plans the way you build a machine out of scraps. Marta's scout party was trapped below the ridge with a patrol between them and our route. The plan we drafted under a lamp was equal parts geometry and prayer. A small diversion to the east, loud, visible, temporary, might pull the patrol's attention. A shadow line would slip through the trees and cut the patrol off from their supply route. If all else failed, we would use the generator to charge a battery bank and run a pump at the well site, fill as many barrels as we could, and send them back by cart under cover of night. The decision to lie hit me harder than I expected. The idea came from the arithmetic of misdirection. Broadcast a false convoy to the far valley, scatters watchers who might otherwise be watching the north route. Deception in small wars is humane. You save more people by telling an untruth than by telling a dangerous truth. But the radio is my altar. We had made a covenant with our listeners, a measure of truth in a world full of myths. To use the voice as bait felt like sacrilege. I held the mic like a relic and thought of Lena's hands stirring coffee, how she hummed into the morning without thinking about strategy. I thought of Jonah stacking rocks and knocking them down with a laugh that did not measure cost. I swallowed the guilt and spoke into the mic anyway. "Attention," I said, my voice steady as if it were a tool I could wield. "Convoy sighted on the east road. Large, moving now. If you're on the north track, stand by." It was not a lie so much as a provocation, a deliberate misdirection to buy a precious hour. I listened to the air like someone listening for a heartbeat. Static hissed. A trader's voice called in, asking for the coordinates of the convoy, likely a greedy echo. Someone else cursed. I coded a follow-up noting the convoy's make and direction, a small garden of details to make the story believable. The delay worked as long as it needed to. The black-flagged patrol answered the bait. The ridge thinned. We moved at dusk. The orchard's shadow line, 4 people, 2 carts, the boy who fixed the still with his jaw set like a seam, slipped through a thinned stand of scrub. The night smelled of dust and the iron-sweet tang of an approaching storm. We used mirrors and cheap signal flares fashioned from a parent's old camping stash. Smoke and reflection are primitive arts of deception. They are also beautiful when they work. By then the sky had begun to change. The wind that had been a tired friend all day turned into something with teeth. Distant clouds bulged like muscle. Strips of black rolled across the moon. Marta's last transmission before we left had been clipped. "We hold. Water good. We've been seen." The final claws landed in the air like a thrown stone and made rings. We found them, the black flags, on the ridge in the space between two dead trees. They were fewer than rumor had made them, but quicker and harder. The leader was a woman, not old and not young, who wore a patch over one eye and moved like she had accepted that power was not given, but taken. Her people had set up a ring of scavenged metal, spikes and makeshift blades. I remember the glint of a knife and the peculiar ordinary horror of the sound of a boot stepping on a tin can. There was a moment when action chooses you. I heard the boy swear under his breath and then run forward. I could have stopped him. I did not. Maybe that is cowardice. Maybe that is faith. We clashed in the crumbling light. It was not cinematic. There was a lot of noise and a lot of bad language. Someone went down. Someone else started to bleed in a place that would leave a stain you could not wash out. I felt the old calculus of guilt and rescue play themselves across my ribs. The cost in lives for a barrel of water. Then the sky broke. It was not rain at first, but a suffocating particulate that tasted like burnt sugar and left a film on the tongue. We had seen storms before, but this was thicker, as if the wind had decided to grind the world into dust and spit it back. Visibility dropped to a few feet. You could feel the storm's weight against your chest like a hand. The black flags faltered. Even predators are cowards when weather turns into a weapon. Our diversion, our small violence, met the larger violence of the sky, and both retreated into something hard and whitish. Marta was hit first. A shard of corrugated metal, loose, carried by a gust, tore into her shoulder. She fell in a tangle of blood and blue fabric that looked too bright against the grey. I remember thinking about Lena and how quickly the world made a body into an image. I dropped my pack and took Marta's shoulder between two hands that knew the language of zippers and thread. The boy, he who fixed the still, was a blur, tearing strips of cloth and pressing them against bone. We had no morphine. We had clean water and a knowledge of dressings. That was what we had. We made it to the well because that is what the land had allowed on that day. A narrow channel of clear, gleaming water wedged into rock like a memory. If this was a well of glass, then the glass was the way the water sat. So still and so unbroken it might have been a pool in a cathedral. The first person to kneel at its edge began to cry, and the sound surprised us all into quiet. You don't expect to hear men cry. It is a sound you forget about until it returns. The pump we had dragged with us, an old hand pump adapted to a small motor, would not run on whispers. The motor needed fuel, and we had promised the generators hours to this task. I unrolled cables and started the generator, feeling its old, knowing cough like a familiar animal. The decision to run the pump was the decision to burn a day's worth of fuel for the life of the orchard. But the water filled barrels fast enough to make the throat unclench. The boy filled and rolled barrels into the shade. Marta yelled numbers. We worked like a machine everyone had learned to be. That is when the black flags returned, not in force, but in a single, deliberate man at the ridge. He called down for parley. We laughed at first because laughter covers fear. Then I talked into the empty air like it was a courtroom and we were making a contract. I had to be a politician for 30 seconds, which is to say I had to speak with a steady voice about what we could share and what we could not. We can give you water now, I said, the generator's thrum filling the gaps. Not the whole well, not the orchard. Take what you can carry and leave the rest. The leader's answer was a grin that meant arithmetic. She wanted the cart too. She wanted our path. The choice came sharp and precise. Give them the well and keep the orchard, or refuse and risk losing both in a fight we might not win. I thought of children with cupped hands in the morning, of the radio waiting on its table I made a choice that had nothing to do with courage and everything to do with the ledger I kept. I offered negotiation, and the only coin I had left, my voice. We will share now, I said. 2 barrels now for your patrol. Leave the rest and keep the path open. If you take the carts, the road behind you will be watched, and you will find nothing to your east. It was a bargain built from exhaustion and desire. The leader nodded, and for a long, terrible second, something like respect passed between us. Not the kind that forgives, but the kind that acknowledges the worth of another person's hunger. They took the 2 barrels and left without burning us down. Marta's shoulder throbbed but did not kill. The storm thinned into a fine, grey drizzle that tasted of iron. We filled 10 barrels and rolled them uphill like a small triumph. We lost a battery and a day's generator hours, but the orchard would not die tonight. I watched the boy's hands as he rolled. They were filthy and steady. In the quiet after, when the generator coughed and then went quiet as the spare coil melted, I thought I had sacrificed the radio's continuous signal for the immediate, raw life of people who were present. The microphone sat on the table like a sleeping thing, waiting. That night, with Marta asleep and bandaged, and with the barrels stacked and the boys and girls passing cups of water and smiling like they had forgotten to be old for a moment, I sat by the dark transmitter and remembered something Lena used to say. You don't have to save the whole world. Miles, save the table. I folded my hands and let the silence answer me. The well of glass was real, and we had it. The black flags had taken something and left us something else. The storm had almost taken everything, but had instead rearranged priorities. The climax is not a single loud note, but the moment when you choose which song to sing. I had chosen to be useful. I had chosen, as I often do, the smaller, messier acts of survival. Patch a shoulder, roll a barrel, lie into a transmitter, over some grand idea of absolute truth. The generator was gone for the night. The radio went quiet, and for the first time in years, the orchard slept with its lips wet and its hands full. I went to sleep thinking about Lena and Jonah and the small truths they'd taught me. How a cup of coffee could hold a morning. How a stack of rocks could be called engineering. Those truths held me like a compass. What the night had given and taken was not yet clear. The well of glass was a pivot. It could feed 1,000 small lives or become a vector for 1,000 greedy ones. The harvest of this moment was real. Barrels full. A woman living who would have died if we had hesitated. And the knowledge that the radio, my voice, had become a weapon as much as a prayer. In the end, the turning point was not about the water alone. It was about the ethics of what I would do in the face of need. I had lied on the air to save them, bargained with a predator, and spent the orchard's power to run a pump. It was messy and costly, but the lives we carried home in barrels were proof that sometimes the right choice is the one that keeps hands busy and children fed. At dawn, the promised return of the radio's light was only a promise. The wires would be fixed. The generator would live again. For now, water sang in barrels and Marta's bandage had a clean line. I sat in the afterlight and wrote the names of those who had come. Marta, the boy, the trader who had told the rumor of the well, into the logbook. I wrote them like prayers. I had been given a choice and I had made it. And the weight of it settled on my shoulders like a new coat. It fit, imperfectly, and I put it on and went to push the barrels toward home. The morning after the storm was not a morning so much as an inventory. Light arrived like a slow accountant, practical, unemotional, pointing at losses and small wins with the same finger. We rolled the barrels into the orchard, under a sky that was still bruised, the air holding a thin metallic hint from the black rain. The water we had filled tasted like salvation and compromise, sweet enough to make children forget to count their spoons, thin enough that the old men who tasted it muttered about minerals and the way a spring keeps the memory of its bed. It was water. That, for now, was the most important thing. The price of the night had been paid in small things, and one big thing. We had run the generator until a coil melted, and the machine went quiet and stubborn. The radio slept. For 2 days, the orchard was effectively cut off from the wider net of voices that had been its lifeline. We had traded continuous contact for immediate life. That trade, once laid out on the table, did not feel noble or ignoble. It simply felt necessary. People used the word sacrifice in the way you might use a spoon, habitually and without much spiritual investment. We had given up light for water. We had given up a battery for a child's sleep. Marta healed with the slow, stubborn patience of the living. The wound on her shoulder took a long time to stop being angry. I sat with stitches and thread and a borrowed hand lens while she told stories in a tone that made the pain less of a singular thing and more like a punctuation in a larger sentence. She joked that the black flags would be disappointed to find us boring once the novelty of theft wore off. She hated being called heroic, and I hated that she hated it. Hero feels like a shape that doesn't fit people who have to sew their own clothes. The boy who had fixed the still. He became a different shape in the days after. He moved with a care that was half iron and half wing. The raid had emptied something out of him. The rescue had filled something else. I could see him counting differently, not just parts and liters, but trust as if it were a fragile tool. The black flag leader had taken 2 barrels and left us with 10. She had taken the smallest coin we had to offer and not burned the orchard to the ground. I still do not know whether that was a bargain sealed by pragmatism or respect. People told stories about the encounter in different tones. Marta said there had been an exchange of names and a moment where teeth and hunger met. and an agreement was quietly cemented. Others said it had been a bluff on our part, and a calculation on theirs. I prefer the ambiguity. It lets me believe in some form of reciprocity, however brittle. The immediate effect of the well was measurable. Children who had been listless found a spring of energy. The goats resumed a slow, suspicious chewing. We diverted 3 barrels a day for the infirm and the old and set aside 2 for seedlings and experimentation. The scientists, that is, the people among us who still referred to themselves as such, ran tests with litmus strips and kettle boils, and a rudimentary spectrometer salvaged from a school lab that now lived on a tripod. The results were not a headline. The well did not cure the valley, nor did it wipe the slate clean. It was a node of cleanliness in a lattice of contamination. We planted cuttings and watched the first tentative leaves open like small flags. Not victory, but possibility. Hope is a funny thing. It does not arrive in banners. It comes in tasks and in the slight relaxation of the jaw as you count seeds. It comes in a child, showing you a sprout and mispronouncing its Latin name and being delighted anyway. It came to us in the form of barter restarting on the North Road because people would risk travel for the chance of filling a barrel. Traders returned, asking for sugar and salt and, in exchange, bringing sketchy rumors about a hospital not entirely dead 2 valleys further. The rumor market is noisy. Believing everything is foolish, trusting nothing is fatal. There were consequences we had not fully calculated. The black flags had noted our location. We had assumed the ridge was now a watched geography. Word of the well spread like a fungus, slow in places and explosive in others. 2 weeks after the pump had run, a group came that called itself neither collective nor gang, but something in between. They presented themselves as mediators, people with maps and signatures and an appetite for taking the middle. They proposed a rota, barrels allocated, patrols shared, a tax for safe passage. The idea was seductive because it promised governance, however ad hoc. Yet authority in our age is a thing that needs 2 things, legitimacy and force. They had legitimacy in the thin paper of copied maps. They had force in numbers and in the way they handled their weapons. We negotiated. We compromised. We suffered. The orchard accepted the rota, but with conditions, regular audits, which were really just checks made by Marta, and 2 old men with an eye for ledger work, the retention of a share of barrels for local seed projects, and the right to refuse the rota if it ever demanded more than our defined share. Accepting the rota meant peace for a while. It also meant that water now had a bureaucratic life. There are ironies in that. A world that drank from wells once ruled by kings now had a rota written on the back of a cereal box. Bureaucracy is human and humanizing. It is also slow and often cruel when applied to scarcity. The rota kept the worst of violence at bay for months, but it also institutionalized privilege. The places with easy access to roads got slightly more water. The places off the map, small encampments and nomadic bands, had to be content with rumor and the scraps that fell from a wagon. I thought often about Lena's saying, "Save the table," and wondered whether my signature on the rota had saved a table. Inside me, something shifted. The man who had lied over the radio to make the patrol look east had to live with the lie. I had told myself the deception was utilitarian, a necessary falsehood. I had always believed that truth was a brittle thing that needed to be bent sometimes for the good of the many. But there were nights after when I would sit in the dark and the transmitter would be cold, like an unloved animal, and I would count the hours I had traded for those barrels. The math did not come out clean. It never does. Guilt is a residue that accrues and changes your taste. In practical terms, I became more careful. In moral terms, I became less trusting and more creative about the ways compassion can be enacted without complete candor. The environmental ledger, meanwhile, grew more complicated. The well did not change the broader physics of the valley. The rains remained convulsive. The air still held an acidic edge in the mornings, and the harvests were better only in plots where we layered compost and gave the soil charcoal. The heavy stuff, the industrial runoff, the loss of topsoil, did not reverse overnight. But there were pockets of repair. Reeds planted around the edge of a diverted channel took up contaminants slowly. The small experiments with biochar hold moisture. We began to think in terms of microclimates, shading, mulching, and human-made windbreaks that altered the immediate thermal dynamics enough to let a seedling live a second season. Healing, when it came as a rumor of biology, not as a headline. I noticed a change in how we treated knowledge. The university professors who once lectured in glass halls now taught under tarps and candlelight. They passed on hard-won techniques, how to inoculate a sapling, how to solder a splice that won't corrode in salt air, how to assemble a slow sand filter using only scavenged parts. Knowledge was no longer academic. It was a survival craft and a social good. People came to listen and returned with hands and ideas, and the orchard became a small school in the afternoons. It felt like planting a future, a slow seed. But the future is not singular. For every lesson and every seedling, there is another tragedy. A month after the well had been integrated into our life, the black flags reappeared. This time not out of hunger, but out of politics. A neighboring collective had decided it wanted a share, and negotiations soured into a brief, ugly exchange that left 2 men dead and a cart burned. Those deaths were not dramatic in the way stories like. They were private and small. A body laid to rest by lantern light. A whispered prayer from a woman who had no use for gods. We patched wounds and inventoried grief. In a way, grief had become another resource we counted. We rationed it, because if you let grief take you wholly, you can no longer plant seeds. What changed in me was a narrowing and a widening at once. My daily rituals, the morning cup, the logbook, the patchwork of radios, became more important. They are small acts of sacrament. At the same time, my horizon widened in a practical way. I began to treat the orchard as less an island and more a node. We could not hoard knowledge or water without it becoming brittle. We had to share to survive, but the terms of sharing had to be thought through. I started to compile lists of techniques and names, and to teach the boy to speak into the radio, not just as a child, but as a future operator. I found myself planning for an end I might not see, training others, saving seeds, writing instructions in a hand that was legible to someone who might be tired. Recovery, where it occurred, came through human patience and modest engineering. We rebuilt fences with recycled struts, created rain gardens to hold water and filter it, and taught children to use spoons with the reverence of a ritual. The well, for all its miracle-sounding name, became less about magic and more about how a community chose to manage a gift. That management was complicated and often ugly in practice, but it was also, in its smallness, the only path forward. The world kept tearing at its edges. Storms came and took. Companies of scavengers pressed at the borders. But we kept building and keeping. In the end, hope felt less like a clean line into the future and more like a bundle of frayed rope that you passed hand to hand. It did not promise rescue. It promised persistence. I stood sometimes at the edge of the orchard after a long day and watched the children play at the lip of the well. They had not yet learned the precise arithmetic of survival. They still thought in seconds and laughter. They were, in their ignorance, a kind of weapon against the dark. I thought of Lena and Jonah and of the way a cup of coffee once made morning whole. I thought of the men who had come and gone with black flags and of how our bargains had reshaped us. The aftermath is not a neat chapter with an epilogue. It is a continued ledger and a living practice. We had water now, but the pump needed parts and the rotor could fail. We had made choices that had consequences, some salvific, some corrosive. The orchard would live a season longer because of the well and because of the compromise we had made. Whether it would last 5 seasons was a question with many variables and few guarantees. Still, in the grey mornings I found myself humming again, softly, as Lena used to do when she stirred coffee. I found my hands steady enough to stitch and my voice willing enough to speak into the dormant radio when the coils were fixed. That was a small thing, a human-scale defiance. If nature was healing, it was doing so the way a scar heals, uneven, sensitive, and imperfect. The big systems, rivers, jet streams, the climate writ large, were still wound tight and unpredictable, but smaller ecosystems, tended by human hands, began to remember how to be. That memory was fragile. It needed tending, rationed water, patient soil work, and protection from people who preferred taking to tending. So we tended. We healed what we could. We argued. We made bargains. We buried the dead. We taught the young. We negotiated with people whose surfaces were callous and who had been softened by small kindnesses into cooperation. I had made a choice in the dark with a microphone and a lie, and the lie had bought us barrels. In the ledger of my life, that entry was messy and significant. The orchard slept more easily for now, the radio hummed less loudly, and the well sang a small, constant note. I counted the barrels like blessings, and in that recent, modest arithmetic, I found a reason to get up in the morning, to save the table, to keep the water moving, to teach a child the name of a plant that could survive here. That, I decided, was enough for the moment. The world does not end in a single moment. It edits itself in small, stubborn strokes, barrels rolled uphill, a wound stitched with too thin thread, a radio left to sleep because the generator has given its last gasp. If you ask me now whether I think things will get better, my answer would be a careful one. Better is not a promise. Better is a practice. After the well, life at the orchard changed in the ways that matter and in the ways that do not. The children run with reason again. They do not count spoons at breakfast. Marta's shoulder will scar but not stop her. The boy who fixed the still talks less and watches more. Sometimes he brings me a strip of copper he scavenged and asks how I'd splice it. We barter with traders who bring sugar and rumours, and the rotor hums its bureaucratic hum that is part protection, part taxation. The black flags did not disappear. They learned where we stacked our barrels and adjusted their routes. We learned, in turn, to make our routes less obvious and our defences less attractive. There are days I wake and I forget for a second that Lena and Jonah are gone. They are ghosts that live in the sleeves of my shirts and the grooves of my tools. Forgetting is painless and then terrible. Remembering is a small, honest pain that makes me move. I do not carry penitence as a weight to punish myself. I carry it as a kind of compass. It points to the table. It points to the small things I still can do. Hope has become a collection of tasks. We saved 10 barrels. We started a seed bank in a tin trunk lined with oilcloth. We teach the children to identify plants that will eat salt and keep the soil alive. We record instructions, how to make a slow sand filter, how to splice a cable, how to hollow a solar still on scraps of paper that might outlast any one voice. Those scraps are an inheritance, not of wealth but of competence. If the orchard lasts a season longer because the boy can mend a pump, then that is hope in structural form. I still lie into the microphone sometimes. I lied the night the black flags were baited east. I lied because it was the cleanest arithmetic I could do with the instruments at hand. One false convoy, 1 hour, the chance to save more than we spent. The radio is an altar and a tool, and I have made both sacred and profane in the same breath. That lie sits in the logbook next to the names of people who came back with water. I do not consider myself redeemed by outcome. I consider myself accountable. Being human now is to live in the contradiction between what you had to do and what you would have preferred to do. The climate around us did not relent. Storms still come with teeth. The jet stream still folds like a sheet in a bad wind. The problems that unmade the old world, exhausted soils, poisoned runoff, heat that sits like a hand on your chest, are not undone by a single well. What the well gave us was time and breathing room. Time can be spent well or poorly. We chose to plant, to teach, to codify small techniques that, if shared, might propagate outward like a slow contagion of competence. There is a difference between hope and optimism. Optimism is the weather report. Hope is the list you keep in your pocket. I have learned to prefer hope. It is quieter and it requires work. You can cultivate it by saving a seed, by patching a roof, by refusing to trade a child's future for a barrel today. The orchard's rota is imperfect. It privileges roads and punishes isolation. We argue about it at council, and sometimes we make bad choices. But argument is a sign of life. Silence is the thing I fear. What has changed inside me is not the absence of fear, but the expansion of responsibility. Early on I thought my duty was to keep a voice on the air. That is still part of my job, but it is no longer everything. My duty is also to teach, to inventory, to write instructions in a hand that makes sense to someone who will be tired when they read it. My duty is to build a table that anyone hungry can come to and leave with a seed and the knowledge of how to plant it. I try to be more generous with knowledge than with barrels because knowledge replicates in ways barrels do not. There are moments of strange grace. I watched a child stand at the well and let water run between her hands as if the water had cancer, and she was testing it for kindness. She laughed when she found a tadpole at the edge and cried when the goat took her sweater. These moments are not evidence that the world will return to what it was. They are evidence that life, messy and irreverent, keeps insisting on itself. That insistence is stubborn and small and enough for now. We prepare because preparation is a form of daily hope. We built cisterns under tarps, trained 2 more mechanics, and kept a reserve of seeds that we rotate so they do not lose vigor. We log names and routes and tolerances for salinity. We practice drills for raids and for storms. We do the unromantic work of governance. Auditing, accounting, arguing over who gets the next barrel. It is not heroic. It is human. If you ask me what my final message would be, if I were to press this hand to the microphone and make one last broadcast, I would say this: keep the table, not as a metaphor but as policy. Share what you can teach. Protect the small green things that remember how to be. Teach a child how to splice a cable and how to call someone on the radio. Keep seeds in tin trunks and names in logbooks. Remember the people you lost, not as ghosts that paralyze you with grief, but as teachers who taught you how to make coffee and how to stack rocks. Let their memory be the grammar of how you live. Do not wait for rescue. Build it in small pieces. If you have a well, teach the neighbor how to filter. If you know how to fix a pump, teach 3 people and make plans to replace you. Everything you hand over multiplies. That is the math we trust now, not miracles, but multiplication. I do not promise salvation. I promise persistence. I promise that as long as there are hands willing to stitch and mouths willing to name, there will be a chance. The world we knew is gone, but the table remains. Imperfect, wobbly, patched with too many screws. We sit around it and pass cups of thin coffee and count spoons with the same reverence as if counting stars. That counting keeps the dark at bay. Tonight, the radio lies silent because the generator is resting and because we have learned the cost of always being audible. Tomorrow I will fix the coil. I will teach the boy a new splice. I will read the logbook and add a name. I will not promise you a better climate. I will not promise you a world mended. I will promise, in the small ways I can, to keep the table set, to keep telling the stories that matter, and to hand to the next waking person a scrap of knowledge and a seed. If enough of us do that, perhaps the ledger will read differently in the years to come. Until then, stay human. Keep your hands busy. Guard the small green things. Speak into the dark when you can, and if you can, share your sugar.